Snow had been falling on the annex since before dawn, and by the time Harlan Moss arrived at the Whitmore estate with his toolbox and his thermos, and the slow, particular dread of a man who already knows the day will not go well, the front walk had not been shoveled. He noticed that first. He always noticed things like that. 17 years as an electrician, 12 of them spent rewiring old houses in Toronto's West End, crawling through century-old knob and tube with a headlamp and a voltmeter, had made him fluent in the language of neglect. A house told you what was wrong with it before you ever opened a wall. You just had to know how to listen. The Whitmore estate spoke in a loud voice. He rang the service bell and waited. Behind him, the city moved in its muffled winter way, buses hissing along Spadina, a streetcar bell somewhere on College. The door opened on a chain, then wider, and the woman who looked out at him was not the woman he had expected. She was in her mid-50s, dark-haired going silver, seated in a power wheelchair with a hospital-grade cervical collar, holding her head at a fixed angle. Her eyes were clear and sharp in a way that suggested a person who had been watching a long time from a position that made it easy to be overlooked. "Mr. Moss," she said. "It wasn't a question. The agency sent me for the panel work." He held up his bag. "I was told the east wing keeps tripping. It does." She moved back to let him in. "I'll show you." Her name was Sylvie Whitmore. He had looked up the estate on his phone while riding the subway north. Whitmore Consolidated, third-generation pharmaceutical distribution, annual revenue that made his brain do something unhelpful, the kind of money that bought old homes and kept them looking lived in from the outside, while everything inside was quietly rearranging itself around one person's comfort, or one person's control. He followed her through the front hall, past walls hung with the careful portraits of people who had died wealthy, and he was watching the baseboards for signs of moisture intrusion when he saw the other thing. The collar. He had wired a spinal rehabilitation clinic on Bloor the previous spring. 3 months of his life inside that building, listening to physiotherapists and engineers argue about assistive devices over cold coffee in the break room. He had absorbed things he had not meant to absorb, the way a man who works with his hands always does, not studying, just watching. The cervical collar Sylvie Whitmore wore was a standard-looking piece of equipment. Rigid foam and plastic, beige, the kind of thing you saw on people recovering from neck injuries. But the hardware at the base of it, the adjustment mechanism that sat just below her left ear, was not standard. It was machined, precision cut. The kind of fastener you saw in aerospace applications, not orthotics. He looked away before she could see him looking. He fixed the panel. It took him most of the morning. A corroded breaker, aluminum wiring on an older circuit that someone had connected to copper without the right junction hardware, the kind of thing that started fires in the night. He replaced what needed replacing and labeled the new work and drank his thermos coffee over the job log. And when he brought the completed forms to the small sitting room where Sylvie Whitmore spent her afternoons, he found her alone. She was reading, or pretending to. The book was open, but she was watching the window. He set the forms on the side table. He picked up his bag. He was at the doorway when the words came out of him, the way they always did when he had been sitting with something too long in silence. "That collar's not right." Her hand stopped on the page. "Pardon me, the adjustment bracket, below your left ear." He kept his voice even. He was good at even. His daughter Mina had said once that he could deliver terrible news in the same tone other men used to discuss hockey scores. It's milled down past spec, something that size should be distributing load across both occipital shelves. Yours is concentrating pressure on the left C2, C3 junction. He paused. "I wired a rehab center. I'm not a doctor." She had turned her head to look at him as much as the collar would allow, which was not far. "Who sent you?" "Wainwright Electrical, same agency as last time." "I meant, who told you to say that?" "Nobody." He held her gaze. "I noticed it when you opened the door. I should have kept walking." The silence that came after was the kind that asked you to fill it. He had learned not to. He let it sit, and he watched her face move through something he recognized from the mirror, the particular calculus of a person deciding whether to trust a stranger, knowing the cost of being wrong in either direction. "Come back on Thursday," she said finally. "There's a second panel in the basement that needs the same work." He came back on Thursday. 16 years before, on a 2-lane highway outside Perry Sound in a November ice storm, a delivery truck had crossed the center line and hit Sylvie Whitmore's car on the passenger side. She had been 41. She had been driving home from a shareholders' meeting, her third in as many weeks, the kind of grinding governance work her father had insisted she learn from the ground up before she took the chair. She had been good at it. She had been looking forward to being better. She woke in Sunnybrook 4 days later to find that her arms still worked, her legs did not, and that her left hand had a tremor that the neurologist said might or might not resolve. Her husband, Leonard, was sitting at the bedside. Her father's closest associate, the man who had been managing her interests since her 20s, was standing in the corner of the room in a dark overcoat, watching. His name was Edmund Voss. He was 60 then. He had come to Whitmore Consolidated as her father's legal counsel 30 years before, and had grown with the company the way certain plants grow. Slowly, close to the ground, spreading in directions no one thought to follow. Her father had called him the steadiest hand he had ever known. Her father had also, in his last year, begun referring to Edmund as "my other son," a phrase Sylvie had found endearing at the time. She no longer found it endearing. Edmund stood in the corner of the hospital room and said very little. What he said was considered, gentle, perfectly calibrated to the specific grief of a woman who had just learned that her body had been redrafted beneath her. He arranged specialists. He arranged the best collar money could find. He arranged a home health care coordinator and a structural consultant and a power wheelchair calibrated to the tremor in her left hand. He arranged everything. Sylvie had let him, because she was exhausted and in pain, and because her father had made her promise in the last months of his life that she would always lean on Edmund when she did not know where else to lean. "Edmund will not fail you. I have trusted him with everything that matters to me, and he has never once given me cause to regret it." Those words had lived in her like a splinter for 16 years. She had not known, could not have known, that the collar Edmund arranged was made by a medical device company incorporated in Fredericton, New Brunswick, 3 months before her accident. That the sole director of that company was a numbered holding entity whose beneficial ownership traced, through 3 layers of shell structure, to Edmund Voss. That the device had been designed by a biomedical engineer in Halifax who had since moved to Dublin and who answered no questions about his previous clients. She had not known any of this. She had known only that the collar hurt and that the specialists Edmund brought to review it all said it was performing exactly as designed. Harlan Moss had a daughter named Ivy. She was 11, and she was the best thing he had ever made. And she had been born with a heart condition that her cardiologist called manageable, and that Harlan called the first thing he thought about every morning, and the last thing he thought about every night. The procedure she needed had been approved once and denied twice by their provincial insurer. Not the province itself, but the supplemental carrier, a private plan through his union that had been renegotiated the year Ivy was born. The denial letters were polite and identically worded, and explained in careful passive voice that the treatment did not meet current criteria for medical necessity under the applicable benefit structure. He had appealed twice. He had a third appeal in process. He had spoken to 3 different caseworkers and 1 supervisor, and had been told, in varying arrangements of the same words, that the process was ongoing. He had stopped telling people about it, not because it wasn't happening, but because the specific grief of fighting a form letter had no clean shape, and clean shapes were what people needed to offer sympathy. He had not told Sylvie Whitmore about Ivy on Thursday, or on the Tuesday after that, or on the Friday when he stayed 2 hours past the job, because the basement panel turned out to have a second problem behind the first one, and he could not leave a fire hazard in a house where a woman could not move quickly. She had offered him tea. He had accepted it. They had spoken about the house, about the age of the wiring. The original knob and tube still live in the attic, the particular stubbornness of old houses that had been built by people who expected them to last 3 lifetimes. "My grandfather built this house," she said. "He told my father it would outlast everything they built inside it." "He wasn't wrong," Harlan said. "The bones are solid. It's just the connections that went bad." She looked at him when he said that. He hadn't meant it to land the way it did, but he watched it land and he let it. The collar was the thing he kept returning to in his own head. He had not brought it up again. He had not intended to bring it up the first time. But in the weeks that followed, he found himself at the kitchen table after Ivy was asleep, reading things he had no professional reason to read. Cervical orthotic load dynamics, C2-C3 nerve root compression, pressure-induced demyelination. The forums where physios and biomedical engineers argued about device specifications in the specific jargon of people who spent their days caring about millimeters. He was not a doctor, he knew that. He also knew the difference between a component machined to its intended function and one machined slightly, precisely, deliberately away from it. He had pulled bad components from old panels his whole career. You learned the feel of something built wrong versus something built to fail. They were not the same thing. The schematic came to him by accident. He had been called back to the estate on a Tuesday in February for a different job. The security lighting at the side entrance had gone out, and the property manager, a compact man named Ashford who wore his efficiency like a second coat, had left a door unlocked and a note on the kitchen counter explaining what needed doing. Harlan was checking the conduit run along the back hallway when his ladder knocked a slim folder off the shelf of an open cabinet. He caught it before it hit the ground. He should have set it back without opening it. He opened it. The top page was a technical schematic, a cervical orthotic, rendered in clean drafting lines, dimensions in millimeters, with 2 stamps on the corner. One a device patent number, one a manufacturer's mark he did not recognize. Bellhaven Medical, registered in Fredericton. He read the schematic the way he read electrical drawings, methodically, starting at the load points and tracing the paths. The device was designed on paper to distribute weight and pressure evenly across the occipital shelf and upper cervical spine. Standard engineering. Sensible. Except the adjustment bracket, the one he had noticed below her left ear on the day he first arrived, was mounted at a 5-degree inward cant, just 5 degrees. Nothing that would look wrong to someone who had never held a transit level to a collar fitting, but 5 degrees, sustained over a period of years, against the C2-C3 nerve root, would do something slow and specific and very difficult to distinguish from the natural progression of a spinal injury. In the lower margin of the page, in small type, was a column of component labels. One was listed as an active patch delivery system. Replace at 60-day intervals. Compound reference. BVN7 sustained release. He did not know what BVN7 was. He knew enough to fold the page in half and put it inside his jacket. He finished the job. He left the invoice on the counter. He drove his truck south on Spadina through the gray February afternoon, and he sat outside his house for 20 minutes before going inside. Ivy was doing homework at the kitchen table. She had her mother's eyebrows and his stubbornness, and she looked up and said, "You look like you swallowed something." And he said, "I'm fine." And she returned to her homework with the particular skepticism of an 11-year-old who had been reading adults her whole life. After she was in bed, he looked up BVN7. It took him 40 minutes of searching technical pharmaceutical databases before he found a reference in a clinical trial registry, a synthetic compound developed for controlled-release cervical nerve modulation, originally trialed for pain management. The trial had been suspended in 2014 for adverse effect concerns. The primary adverse effect listed was sustained paresis of the upper extremity musculature, not paralysis, not dramatically, just sustained, reversible suppression of motor signals in the affected nerve roots. The kind of thing that, layered on top of an existing injury, would look like the injury getting worse, or not getting better the way it should. He sat at the kitchen table with the schematic and his laptop and the sound of the furnace cycling on and off, and he thought about Sylvie Whitmore sitting in her chair by the window, watching a street she could not walk out onto. He thought about Ivy's denial letters stacked in the folder on top of the refrigerator. He had promised himself after Nora died, a year after the accident, the grief and the caregiving and the sleeplessness having assembled themselves into a cardiac event that her cardiologist said should not have happened, and which Harlan had understood, without being able to prove, had happened partly because she had been denied the stress management program 3 times in 8 months. He had promised himself that he would not let a system designed by people who counted in columns decide what his daughter's body deserved. He had been keeping that promise with forms and phone calls. He picked up his phone and sent a message. Just a name and a time. He had met Dr. Pravina Nair at the rehabilitation clinic on Bloor, in the break room where the physiotherapists argued about devices over cold coffee. She had been the one arguing hardest. She had also been the one who lost, quietly, without announcement, the hospital privileges she had held for 11 years, 2 months after she published a letter in a medical journal questioning the approval process for a specific class of cervical orthotic devices. She was running a private practice out of a converted house on Gerrard now. She did not discuss why she had left the hospital system. She discussed it with Harlan over the phone at 11 on a Wednesday night, because Harlan had handed her a folded schematic across a parking lot that afternoon, and she had looked at it for 40 seconds in the winter light and gone very still. "Where did you get this?" she said. "I found it, Harlan. I found it in a cabinet in a house where I was doing electrical work. I'm not going to say more than that right now." A long silence. BVN-7 was supposed to be destroyed after the trial suspension. Her voice had the particular flatness of a person controlling something. "I wrote 2 reports about that compound. I was told both times the file was closed." "Who told you?" "The ethics board." And Edmund Voss, who sat on the ethics board at the time as an industry representative. A pause. "He sat on that board for 9 years. Harlan looked at the ceiling of his truck. Outside, the streetlights had come on along Gerrard, throwing orange light across the snow. "I need you to meet someone," he said. He did not go back to the estate that week. He waited. He thought about the men who had filed into that house in their careful overcoats. The specialist Edmund had arranged. The health coordinator, who had a magnetic badge that said Whitmore Care Team, and who had been working in that house for 14 years. He thought about access and sight lines, and the particular invisibility of a man who came to fix things and left without being remembered. He went back on a Tuesday, on a booked call for the attic panel that still needed work. Ashford let him in and went about his day, and Harlan worked through the morning, and at noon he knocked on the door of the sitting room with his job log and a question about the attic ventilation that didn't need asking. Sylvie was alone. He set the log on the table. He did not sit. He took the folded schematic from his jacket pocket and laid it flat on the side table beside her tea, and he stepped back. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for resistance. What he had not prepared for was the quality of the silence. Not shock, not denial, but something older. The silence of a woman who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for a specific door to open. "Bellhaven Medical," she said. "Yes." Edmund arranged my device. She said it to the window, not to him. "He arranged everything." "I know." She picked up the schematic. Her left hand trembled slightly. It always did. And she held the page steady with both hands and read it the way she read everything, from the margins in. He had noticed that about her. She read the small print first. When she put the page down, her face was arranged into something that was not calm but resembled it from a distance. "Mr. Moss," she said, "I'm going to need you to leave." He left. He was in his truck at the end of the drive when his phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. It contained one sentence. "Pravina Nair, tomorrow, bring Ivy's file." He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and drove home. She did not sleep. She sat by the window in the dark of her bedroom and listened to the house, the creak of the radiators, the wind finding the gap at the north dormer she had never gotten around to fixing, the particular quiet of a Toronto winter night that pressed against glass like something that wanted in. The brace hummed at her neck. It always hummed A faint mechanical resonance she had stopped noticing, the way you stopped noticing a sound that had been part of every day for 16 years. The way you stopped noticing anything that had always been there. She thought about Edmund standing in the corner of the hospital room in his dark coat. The way he had moved nothing in his face when the neurologist said the injury was significant. The way he had already had the specialist's name ready before anyone asked. She thought about her father. In the last weeks of his life, her father had been lucid in the mornings and somewhere else by afternoon. And she had learned to have important conversations before noon. One morning he had taken both her hands and said, with the specific urgency of a man trying to cross something important from one mind to another before the bridge went out, "There's a safety deposit box at the Bloor Street branch. The key is in the blue tin in the top left drawer of my desk. If you ever find yourself in a place where you do not know who to trust, start there." She had thought at the time that he was talking about the business. She had found the tin after he died and opened the box, and found inside it 3 sealed envelopes and a handwritten note that said, "For Sylvie, not to be opened until necessary. You will know when." She had put the envelopes back. She had not thought she would ever need them. Edmund was there. Edmund was reliable. Edmund would never. She rolled to her closet. The blue tin was on the top shelf, where she had put it 16 years ago, after retrieving the key from the safety deposit box and deciding she was not ready. The key was still inside. She held it for a moment. Then she called Marguerite. Marguerite Fowles had been her father's executive assistant for 22 years, before she retired to a house in Oakville, where she grew heirloom tomatoes, and answered the phone in 2 rings at any hour. She was 73, and had the specific authority of a woman who had spent 2 decades knowing everything about everyone, in a building full of people who believed she noticed nothing. The call lasted 4 minutes. Marguerite asked no questions. She said, "I'll be at the Bloor branch when it opens. Tell me where to send it." The envelopes arrived by courier at noon the following day. The first contained a letter from a biomedical engineer in Halifax, dated 7 years before the accident, describing a commission he had received from Edmund Voss for a specialized cervical collar with adjustable neural modulation capability. The letter expressed discomfort. It described the meeting. It named the compound BVN7. The second contained a copy of a patent application for the Bellhaven medical device, filed 4 months before the accident, with Edmund Voss listed as the sole assignee. The royalty structure showed $9.4 million annually from a healthcare trust she recognized immediately as the Whitmore Family Medical Fund, the fund that paid for her care. She had been paying for the device that was being used on her. She had been signing the quarterly disbursements herself. The third envelope contained a letter from a Toronto neurologist, dated 18 months after the accident. It was addressed to Edmund Voss. It reported the findings of an independent imaging review of Sylvie Whitmore's cervical injury, conducted at the neurologist's own initiative after reviewing her original scan. The letter stated that the initial cord trauma, while significant, showed substantial preserved axonal structure at C3-C4. The letter recommended immediate device review and a supervised reduction protocol that the neurologist believed would result in meaningful, possibly complete, motor recovery in the upper extremities over a period of 12 to 18 months. The letter had never been forwarded to her. Across the bottom in Edmund's handwriting were 3 words, "Not at this time." Sylvie set the third envelope on her lap and looked out the window at the snow coming down over the old oaks her grandfather had planted, and she understood, with the complete unhurried clarity of a woman who had run a pharmaceutical distribution company for 16 years, exactly what had been done to her, and why, and by whom, and for how long. She did not weep. She had spent her weeping on things that deserved it less. She picked up her phone and called Harlan Moss. The removal took 3 weeks. Pravina Nair conducted it in her converted house on Gerrard with an IV stand she had modified for cervical application, and a monitoring setup she had ordered from a supplier in Calgary and assembled herself in a weekend. She ran the detox protocol slower than a hospital would have, because the BVN7 had been administered continuously for 11 years, through the active patch system in the collar. And its metabolites had embedded themselves in the C2, C4 nerve sheaths in a way that Pravina described in her notes as organized. Not random accumulation, but structured suppression, maintained at precise therapeutic levels, never enough to be flagged on a standard talk screen, but enough, sustained over years, to suppress the recovery that should have begun 14 months after the initial injury. The first week was the worst. The nerve roots waking up did not feel like healing. It felt, Sylvie told Harlan on the fourth day, like someone was removing a splinter with a wrench. She said it without self-pity, which he had come to understand was simply how she said things. He came every evening after dropping Ivy at Mrs. Kowalski's next door. He brought food, sandwiches from the deli on Queen, once a container of soup his mother had taught him to make when he was 8, and which he had not made since Nora died. He sat in the chair by the window, and they talked while Pravina made notes in the other room. And sometimes they did not talk at all, which Harlan had found over the weeks was a different kind of conversation. He told her about Nora, not all of it. He had not told all of it to anyone. The particular geography of a grief you have been carrying alone long enough that it has become structural, but some of it. The morning he had gone to the parking lot behind the hospital to cry where Ivy couldn't see him, and how he had looked up and seen a red-tailed hawk sitting on a light standard doing nothing in particular, just sitting, and how for reasons he could not explain it had helped. She told him about her father, about the mornings when he had been lucid, and what they had managed to pass between them in those hours, about the specific guilt of a daughter who had trusted the man her father trusted, and whether that trust was the same as complicity. He said he did not think it was. She said she needed time to believe that. Ivy came on Saturdays. She brought her homework and did it on a folding table in the corner of Pravina's consultation room, and she talked to Sylvie with the direct, unsentimental curiosity of a child who had grown up around illness and had no patience for dancing around it. In the third week, Sylvie lifted her right hand above shoulder height for the first time in 11 years. It shook. It went only as far as her collarbone before the muscles gave out, and she had to lower it. But it went, and Pravina wrote it down in her notebook, and Harlan was standing at the window when it happened, and he did not turn around for a moment because he needed that moment. The Saturday before the board meeting, Ivy brought a card she had made at school. It was construction paper, green, with a drawing on the front in marker. A woman sitting in a chair with her arm raised, and beside the chair, just slightly away from it, an empty space where the chair had been, and the woman standing. Ivy's handwriting across the top, the particular large uneven printing of a child who had been practicing. "You're almost there." Inside, in smaller letters, "My dad says the hardest part isn't getting up. He says it's knowing you're going to. My mom used to say something like that too. I think they were both right." Sylvie held the card in both hands for a long time. "Your dad tells me you have a procedure coming up," she said. Ivy shrugged with one shoulder, the exact gesture Harlan made when he was trying not to make something bigger than it was. "They keep saying no. I know." Sylvie folded the card carefully. "They won't keep saying it." Edmund Voss arrived at the Whitmore Consolidated Board meeting at 9 in the morning in a charcoal overcoat that had cost more than Harlan's truck. He had a soft leather portfolio under his arm, and the particular composure of a man who had run the same room for a very long time and expected to keep running it. The chair at the head of the table was empty. He had a document in his portfolio, a medical assessment of the current CEO's capacity to lead, assembled from records that he had spent 3 months curating, signed by 2 physicians whose consulting agreements ran through a numbered company in Delaware. The document was the last piece of a structure he had been building for 11 years. The Whitmore estate, the distribution network, the care trust, the licensing agreements with 3 American pharmaceutical chains. All of it held in a legal architecture that terminated, in the event of a capacity ruling, in Edmund Voss as sole successor trustee. He opened the meeting. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened. She came in on a walking frame, Canadian-made aluminum, adjusted that morning by Pravina to the exact height of her extended arms. She walked slowly. The walk was not graceful. It was the walk of a body relearning a conversation with the floor, and every step cost something, and she paid it without looking at her feet. 7 steps from the door to the chair. By the 4th step, the room had stopped breathing. By the 7th, she was at the head of the table, and she set her hands on the back of the chair, her grandfather's chair, the one he had sat in for 30 years, the one her father had sat in, the one Edmund had occupied as acting chair for 11 years, and she remained standing. Harlan came in behind her. He was in a blazer and his good jeans, which was the best he had, and he set a folder in front of each board member without speaking. Belhaven Medical Incorporation documents, the Halifax engineer's letter, the patent assignment and royalty records, Pravina's clinical documentation of the compound and its effects, the suppressed neurologist's report with Edmund's 3 words in the margin. Edmund's face did not change. He had a remarkable face that way. The RCMP officers came through the main door. The Toronto police came through the service entrance. Edmund looked at the service entrance once, briefly, in the way a man looks at the one variable he had not fully modeled, and then his composure closed over it like water. They walked him out through the boardroom door in front of 12 people who had watched him run things for 11 years. He did not speak. He did not look at Sylvie. He looked at Harlan, and Harlan looked back and did not look away, and Edmund Voss walked out of the Whitmore estate for the last time. The capacity petition was withdrawn before noon. The merger negotiations that Edmund had been quietly advancing with an American distribution chain were suspended pending a full governance review. Sylvie ordered an immediate audit of every claim denial issued through the Whitmore Family Health Trust in the preceding 4 years, with manual review by an independent panel. She made 2 calls herself that afternoon. The first was to the Belhaven Medical Patient Registry, which she directed her legal team to pursue for a full accounting of every device that had been placed under the original patent. The second was to the supplemental carrier that held Harlan's union benefits plan. She made it from the boardroom in front of 3 of her directors, and she asked for the name of the person responsible for the Ivy Moss file, and she asked that person to remain available for a call in the morning. By May, the house on Galley Avenue was full of afternoon light. It was a semi-detached in Roncesvalles that Sylvie had bought in March because it had no stairs, a wide front door, and a back garden with a low cedar fence and 2 old apple trees that bloomed in the first week of May in a way that embarrassed everything around them. Pravina came for dinner on Sundays. She had reapplied for hospital privileges in February. The application was under review at 3 institutions. Harlan had taken a position on the Facilities and Building Systems team at Whitmore Consolidated. Not management. Not a title he had asked for, but a role that let him set his own hours and do the kind of diagnostic work he had always done best, which was look at the way things were built and figure out where the load was going wrong. Ivy's procedure had been approved in January and completed in March. Her cardiologist had called it textbook. She was back at school, riding her bike on the rail trail, fighting with Harlan about screen time with the full-throated energy of a child who had remembered, at 11, what it felt like to be well. On a Thursday evening in May, Sylvie sat on the back porch without the walking frame. She had set it inside before coming out. She did not always need it now, and on the evenings when the porch was warm and the light was long, and the apple trees were doing what apple trees did, she did not want anything between her and the boards under her feet. Across the garden, Harlan was helping Ivy build something with scrap lumber from a demolition site he'd been working. A raised bed for tomatoes, Ivy had decided, because she had heard from Marguerite that tomatoes were worth the trouble. Harlan was explaining joinery. Ivy was explaining that his method was inefficient. The argument had been going for 20 minutes and showed no signs of resolution. Sylvie watched them. The light came through the apple trees in long diagonal bars, the particular gold of a Toronto evening in May, and it fell across the cedar fence and the new grass, and the 2 of them crouched over their lumber. And it was so ordinary, it was almost unbearable, the way good things sometimes were after a long time of not having them. She pressed her bare feet flat against the warm wood of the porch. Below the boards was the foundation. Below the foundation was the earth, the old clay soil of the lakeshore that had been settling for 10,000 years, solid and unhurried and entirely indifferent to what happened above it. She felt it hold her. After 16 years, she finally let it.